Blaise Pascal stands as one of those thinkers who refuse to fit neatly into the categories we build for them. A mathematician of formidable precision and a Christian philosopher of radical humility, he lived in the 17th century, an era obsessed with reason, clarity, and the dream that everything could be demonstrated mathematically. And yet, in the middle of this age of rational triumph, Pascal insisted on something profoundly unsettling, that the existence of God could not be proven, not by logic, not by geometry, not by any intellectual tool the human mind possesses. This position already sets him apart from many of his contemporaries. René Descartes, for instance, born a generation before Pascal, believed he had found a rational path toward proving the reality of God. Descartes' famous ontological argument claims that God must exist simply because a perfect being cannot lack existence. For him, God's essence includes his existence, just as the essence of a triangle includes its three angles. Pascal looks at this reasoning and quietly shakes his head, not because he rejects God, far from it, but because he sees a profound limitation in the human mind. A century later, Immanuel Kant will make a similar point. Descartes hasn't demonstrated God's existence. He has merely placed existence inside the definition. You can define a perfect triangle or a perfect island, but this doesn't force them into reality. Both Kant and Pascal share this conviction. The divine escapes the reach of pure rationality. This is where Pascal introduces one of his most powerful distinctions, the difference between the truths of reason and the truths of the heart. Reason, he says, knows how to calculate, deduce, and demonstrate. It can build machines, like Pascal himself did with the Pascaline, the first mechanical calculator. But the heart perceives in another way. It grasps intuitions that logic cannot domesticate. It feels the presence of something greater before it can articulate it. This wasn't merely a philosophical claim for Pascal. It was an experience. One night, in what he later called his night of fire, he felt overwhelmed by a sense of divine reality so intense and intimate that he stitched the account of it into his coat, keeping it close to his body until his death. That experience reshaped his life and convinced him that faith was not the product of argumentation, but of encounter, not something the mind proves, but something the soul receives. If Pascal's distinction between reason and the heart is already provocative, the real tension appears when we confront a practical problem. What do you do with someone who refuses to believe unless you provide a rational proof? It is one thing to affirm that God cannot be demonstrated. It is another to face a world full of skeptics, agnostics, and rationalists who are simply unmoved by mystical experiences or theological authority. How do you speak to those who demand reasons instead of revelations? For Pascal, this is not a minor issue. In his time, as in ours, many thinkers relied on the power of the intellect to navigate every question of life. If something exists, they argued, the mind should be able to grasp it or at least infer it. Anything beyond that seems suspicious. So when a believer says, I know God exists because I felt his presence, the skeptic hears nothing but subjectivity, an inner state impossible to verify and therefore impossible to accept. Pascal understands this conflict deeply. He knows that his own night of fire cannot serve as evidence for anyone else. Faith that is born from personal experience stays personal. It cannot be transferred like a mathematical theorem or reproduced like a scientific experiment. That is its beauty and also its limitation. So he asks himself, how can one invite non-believers to take faith seriously without pretending to offer a proof that doesn't exist? This question becomes even more pressing when we remember that Pascal is not dismissive of reason. He is a mathematician. After all, he respects logic, probability, and the clarity of structured argumentation. What he rejects is the illusion that reason alone can access what lies beyond its own domain. But within its domain, reason remains a powerful tool, powerful enough, perhaps, to guide the skeptic toward a new kind of reflection. This is precisely where the seeds of the wager begin to form. Pascal notices that skeptics make decisions in everyday life without certainty. They invest money, choose careers, build relationships, all without proof of what the future will bring. They navigate risk constantly and rely on probabilities more often than they admit. In other words, even the most rational minds are already engaged in acts of trust and calculated bets. So the challenge is not to prove God, but to show the skeptic that not choosing is impossible. Neutrality is an illusion. In the great question of God's existence, everyone is already involved, whether they want to be or not. The skeptic believes he is standing outside the game, arms crossed, waiting for evidence. Pascal suggests instead that the skeptic is already playing, already betting, simply by living as if God did not exist. Now Pascal moves into the heart of his argument, and he does it with a disarming clarity. Instead of trying to climb toward God through metaphysics or mystical testimonies, he proposes something almost playful. Imagine that belief is a wager. He knows this sounds strange at first. Religion, after all, is usually spoken of in the language of revelation, duty, or salvation, not in the vocabulary of gambling. But this contrast is precisely what gives Pascal's idea its force. A wager makes the stakes visible. Here is the reasoning. You cannot avoid choosing. Either you live as if God exists, or you live as if he doesn't. There is no third option, no suspended state. Every action you take commits you implicitly to one side or the other. And because you must choose, Pascal suggests evaluating each option the same way we evaluate uncertain situations in daily life, by comparing what we stand to gain and what we stand to lose. If God exists and you choose to believe, the gain is unimaginable, the possibility of eternal happiness. If God exists and you choose disbelief, the loss is equally immense. Separation, damnation, or at the very least, the absence of what could have been infinite joy. Now consider the alternative. If God does not exist, and you choose to believe, what have you lost? A handful of pleasures, a few freedoms you might have exercised differently. Losses, yes, but finite ones. And if you do not believe and God does not exist, then you gain nothing more than those same fleeting pleasures. Pascal compresses this logic into one simple idea. An infinite gain outweighs any finite risk. Even the smallest possibility of an infinite reward is enough to overshadow the limited cost of belief. The rational choice, when faced with two uncertain outcomes, is to choose the one with the greater potential, a principle not only of philosophy but of economics, probability theory, and everyday prudence. But Pascal pushes further. Belief is not merely an intellectual assent. It demands practice, discipline, habit. Skeptics quickly object. If I live as a believer and God does not exist, I lose real pleasures, love, desire, freedom. Pascal acknowledges this, but he reframes the issue. What you lose are temporary satisfactions, often accompanied by their own complications and miseries. What you gain, even in the absence of God, are virtues, stability, moral clarity, and a life shaped by meaning rather than impulse. Pascal's wager is not a trick. It is an invitation to think about existence in terms of stakes, consequences, and the long horizon of the soul. In a universe where certainty is impossible, he argues that rationality itself leads us to choose the path that promises the highest return, even if that return lies beyond what reason can wholly grasp. Up to this point, Pascal's reasoning seems smooth, almost intuitive. Yet a deeper objection rises, one that strikes at the very foundation of the wager. Why should we assume the chances of God existing are equal to the chances that he doesn't? The metaphor of a coin toss, this tidy 50-50 division, feels artificial to many skeptics. An atheist might say, the probability of God existing is not equal to the probability of his absence. It is close to zero. For them, the universe appears silent, and silence is not evidence. Pascal anticipates this resistance. He understands that probability, when applied to metaphysical questions, becomes slippery. You cannot count the frequency of divine appearances or measure the likelihood of transcendence the way you measure weather patterns or the decay of particles. There is no dataset, no long-term record, no statistical curve to analyze. This absence of information is precisely Pascal's point. For Pascal, the equality of probabilities does not come from the nature of God, but from the limits of reason. When the mind confronts an object entirely beyond its reach, it has nothing to calculate with. It cannot assign a higher chance to one outcome, because it possesses no evidence at all, not even enough to form a guess. In this void, reason becomes silent, and the silence forces a strange symmetry. The two possibilities, existence or non-existence, float before us with no rational weight attached to either. This is why Pascal insists that the mind is not rejecting evidence. It is acknowledging the absence of evidence. And when evidence is absent, rational judgment collapses into neutrality. The balance does not tilt toward God, but neither does it tilt toward atheism. We stand in a position of radical ignorance, facing two doors that look identical from the outside. If we cannot know what is behind them, then probability no longer guides a choice. Something else must. This something else is not irrationality, but a different mode of reasoning, one that evaluates choices not by likelihood but by consequences. Pascal argues that in the absence of statistical guidance, the rational mind should shift to another metric, the magnitude of what could be gained or lost. Even if the probability of God were small, the potential outcome, eternity, remains infinite, and infinity overwhelms any finite calculation. This argument is unsettling because it redefines what it means to be rational. It suggests that human reason must sometimes accept its own boundaries and choose based not on certainty, but on the structure of risk itself. In that sense, Pascal is not defending faith against reason. He is asking reason to recognize when it reaches the edge of its own domain. At this stage, Pascal's wager shifts into something broader than a theological argument. It becomes a lens through which to examine the very structure of human life. Pascal recognizes that people recoil at the idea of betting on God because the term sounds frivolous, even irreverent. But what he really wants to show is that the logic of the wager is already embedded in our daily existence. Belief in God is not the exception. It is simply the most dramatic instance of a pattern we repeat constantly. Think of trust. Every meaningful relationship begins with an act of confidence that is no guarantee. When you confide a secret to someone, you wager that this person will remain silent tomorrow and the next day and the next. You have no proof. All you possess is a mixture of past impressions and hope. Or consider marriage. It is, in its essence, a long-term bet that two lives can grow in harmony. You stand before another human being and promise fidelity, without any certainty about what they will become, what you will become, or what circumstances will test you both. We trust because not trusting would imprison us in isolation. We choose loyalty without guarantees because life becomes unbearable without the possibility of shared meaning. In this sense, Pascal's wager does not introduce a strange mechanism. It reveals a structure already present in our emotional and moral choices. We are creatures who must commit, even though commitment is always a risk. What makes trust so powerful is that it involves both vulnerability and courage. To trust is to admit that you may be wrong, that someone may disappoint you. That betrayal is possible. Yet the alternative, closing the door on every potential connection, costs far more. Pascal sees in this dynamic an analogy to the decision of belief. The leap toward God mirrors the leap toward others. It arises not from certainty, but from the recognition that certain forms of goodness can only be accessed through commitment. Even in secular contexts, the logic persists. We trust the future when we make plans, though the future is a vast unknown. We trust institutions that may fail us. We trust our own bodies to carry us forward, though they inevitably decline. Every time we invest energy, affection, or hope, we wager that reality will meet our expectations in some way. And the truth is that, like Pascal's wager, these bets can succeed or collapse without warning. In this light, faith is not an anomaly. It is an extension of the human condition. Believing in God becomes one more instance of a universal pattern. Choosing to commit when certainty is impossible. Pascal suggests that faith is not opposed to reason, but grows from the same soil as trust, an acceptance of uncertainty combined with a desire to seek what lies beyond it. When Pascal frames belief as a wager, he is not merely crafting a clever argument. He is exposing a deeper truth about our relationship to the future. The future, more than anything else, is the horizon that constantly escapes us. It approaches, then retreats. We walk toward it, yet it remains untouched. This inaccessibility is precisely what makes it resemble the divine. Both are realms we can imagine, anticipate, or hope for, but never fully grasp. And yet we build our lives around them. Every decision we make is anchored in a future that remains opaque. You study because you believe it will matter. You save money because you assume tomorrow will arrive. You sacrifice today for a distant possibility that may or may not unfold. The entire architecture of human action rests on projections into an elsewhere that the present cannot verify. In a way, we live suspended between what we know and what we long for, and this tension defines what it means to be human. Pascal understands that the wager is not only about God, it is about the kind of beings we are. We inhabit a world governed by uncertainty, where no promise is guaranteed and no outcome is secure. The future does not show us its cards. Yet we bet on it constantly with our choices, our sacrifices, and our desires. In this sense, the wager on God becomes a symbolic reflection of the wager on life itself. Both require stepping into the unknown, guided only by a mixture of intuition, courage, and hope. And here lies Pascal's subtle insight. Even when we believe we are being cautious, neutral, or purely rational, we are still wagering. Refusing to love is a bet against heartbreak. Refusing to trust is a bet against disappointment. Refusing to believe in anything larger than ourselves is a bet on the sufficiency of the present moment. The illusion is not in betting. The illusion is in thinking we can avoid it. Life forces our hand. This is why Pascal insists that reason alone cannot determine the ultimate question, but neither can reason step aside. For even when reason recognizes its limits, it plays a role in guiding us through those limits. It tells us when evidence is missing, when the scales are balanced, and when the only rational step is to examine what lies beyond calculation. Reason does not abolish the wager. It illuminates the conditions under which the wager becomes unavoidable. The future remains unknowable, and what lies beyond it even more so. But our orientation toward that uncertainty, whether through belief, doubt, trust, or fear, shapes the entire texture of our existence. Pascal's wager asks us to contemplate not just what we believe, but how we live in the face of the unknown. In the shadow of this unknowability, faith becomes less a doctrine than a stance, an openness toward what we cannot yet see and possibly can never fully understand.